For those of you that haven't joined us before, I'd just like to introduce you to and hand over to Georgie Caines, who is the Barossa Improved Grazing Group's Technical Facilitator and Coordinator. Georgie.
Thanks, Tara, and thanks everybody for joining in to our webinar tonight. This slide is just a very quick rundown of what we do with the Barossa Improved Grazing Group. At the moment, we've got a Meat and Livestock Australia pasture producer demonstration site looking at different pastures happening in the Barossa area and how they perform in our local environment. Also got soil moisture monitoring, which is one of the first soil moisture monitoring to occur in pasture situations. We've also got lots of newsletters, lots of handy information, videos, case studies, fact sheets, lots of different things going on. And if you want any more information, please head over to our website just there. This webinar today, as we know, it's been a pretty dry start, particularly in the Barossa. A dry spring last year, dry summer this year, and leading up to what we're experiencing now, which is still a very dry winter. Our soil moisture probes are showing that our soil moisture is still pretty low. So this webinar is about looking at strategies on how we can manage our grazing. We need to thank, most importantly, the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin Natural Resources Management Board and the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges Natural Resources Management Board through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program and the NRM levies. So they've supported this webinar tonight, so thank you very much to them. So without further ado, I'll hand back over to Tara and we'll get into the webinar.
Awesome, thanks Georgie. Now, just to familiarise Simon, our presenter tonight, with the audience, we've just got a couple of questions before we get started. So if you could please just select on your screen where you're located so that Simon knows where everybody's listening in from. Awesome, thank you. So as you can see, we've got 46% listening in from interstate, 20 from the Barossa and surrounding areas, 14 from the Adelaide Hills and Fleurieu, 17 from elsewhere in SA, and 3% from the Murraylands and Mallee. Thank you. Now, sorry guys, just a slight technical issue. I do have another question for you, but my computer has decided that you're not allowed to answer them. So without further ado, I might just pass you over to Simon, who is going to present for us tonight. So Simon, I'll just make you the presenter.
Very good. Well, thanks everyone for the opportunity to have a chat tonight on grazing strategies for a dry winter, or essentially how to get the best out of our winter that's coming up. So yeah, I'll work through. So yeah, my name's Simon Vogt. I'm an agribusiness consultant with Rural Directions. I've been with Rural Directions for 8 years now. I've got a commerce and finance background, spent some time in the family farming business, and now work with Rural Directions in an agribusiness consultant capacity. I've got significant farm benchmarking experience through both benchmarking one-on-one with farm businesses and also a number of benchmarking related projects for the likes of the GRDC and MLA. I also deliver the MLA Southern Business Edge workshops in South Australia, which is a 2-day workshop on financial literacy and wealth creation and understanding the key profit drivers in grazing enterprises. And I also deliver 2 or 3 pasture principles groups per year, and a number of the insights that we'll talk through this evening have a foundation in the pasture principles workshop and coaching package that we offer and deliver to producers throughout South Australia and Western Victoria. So just a little bit more on the Pasture Principles package, given that it's where a number of the insights come from tonight. It's a supported learning package which is offered under MLA's new Profitable Grazing Systems platform, which is a replacement platform for making more from sheep and more beef from pastures. And the PGS platform is based around supported learning projects or packages like Pasture Principles that involve some theory up front, followed by some on-farm group-based coaching sessions. And the Pasture Principles package is an example of a PGS eligible activity, and that one in particular involves an initial 2-day workshop on the theory of grazing management, followed by 6 on-farm group-based coaching sessions, which is essentially there to support and drive the implementation of the knowledge. And the Pasture Principles package is supported by an excellent manual and a range of tools. And we have 2 new groups starting in SA in late June if they are of interest. In terms of a session plan for this evening, this is the aspects that I'd like to work through. I note the number of interstate listeners online tonight, which is fantastic, and there'll be some references beyond just the Barossa as well, but there is a couple of slides that are a little Barossa focused. We'll look at the dry autumn in parts of SA in 2018. We'll look at some local dry matter production for the month of May 2018. We'll look at using leaf stage as a barometer for rest periods and understanding how leaf stage has an influence on total dry matter production from pastures at different times in the year. We'll look at influence and control, strategies to optimise winter pasture production, and specifically nitrogen and rotation length and soil fertility and ground cover. Then spend some time. Yes.
Sorry, everyone just can't see your screen. Have you shared that?
Sorry, thank you.
There we are. That's much better. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah. So yeah, that's the. I'll just work through these slides. Yeah, sorry that I missed that. Yeah, so there's the session plan there that I've just been talking through, and then have a discussion in regard to pasture allocation. If we have a look at the Barossa in the mid-north and have a look at year-to-date rainfall from the 1st of January through until today, we'll see that the Barossa and mid-north region, those towns there, Maribel and Kapunda and Yurupta and Lindok and Cainton and Cambrai, we've got a on average of 40 millimetres below year-to-date. So that's demonstrates that in the Barossa and mid-north, we have certainly had a dry summer and a dry autumn and a dry 5 months to the start of the year. And but that isn't statewide. The lower southeast is looking quite strong. Western Victoria and parts of Victoria are certainly looking very strong and are at or above year-to-date rainfall in many cases. And understand that there's some very dry and really tough conditions in New South Wales. So I guess it's important to recognise that while we're talking about a dry autumn, and that's particularly the case in Barossa and the mid-north, it isn't the case everywhere as such. So this was a photo, and I thought it'd be interesting just to take a look at this photo and reflect on the location and the year and the month. And for those familiar with the Barossa, it looks a little bit like Anguston in mid-August perhaps. But this photo was actually taken on Thursday last week, on the 31st of May, in the southern Grampians region, and there's about 2,600 kilograms of dry matter there. So, yes, that region has had an excellent April and May, and so they've had more favourable rainfall conditions than what we've seen locally in the Barossa. But there's also some management in the last 6 weeks that's enabled them to get that level of pasture production at the end of May and set them up for the winter months ahead. So just thought it'd be interesting to share that. And then if we now revert back to the Barossa and mid-north region where we are 40 millimetres below year-to-date rainfall. These are some measurements that have been taken in the last 2 days in regard to some dry matter production on a couple of different pasture types and under some different management. So the first one there is a permanent improved ryegrass and clover pasture. It's been rested since the break. The break was on the 16th of April, and there's 1,800 to 1,900 kilograms of dry matter on that particular pasture, which is suggesting that it's grown at 42 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day since the break on the 16th of April. The next one is an example of a permanent pasture that was grazed during May, and so it's been grazed since the break, and taking into consideration the pasture that's been harvested from grazing, total dry matter production for that pasture has been 800 to 900 kilograms per hectare, and so we see 20 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day growth rate there, which is quite a bit different to the pasture above it. So same pasture type with strong, excellent level of ground cover, just different level of rest and management in the last 6 weeks. And naturally, it comes at a cost not to graze pastures and to rest pastures. We either have to supplementary feed stock in paddock or have them in containment areas. But we are seeing some significant differences there in dry matter production, and we'll explore that further in terms of what's driving those differences based on the 50 or so millimetres of rainfall that's been received in this region since mid-April. And the third example there is a sown cereal and vetch that's been rested since the break, and there's 600 to 700 kilograms of dry matter available in that pasture. And that one's been growing at 16 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. So it's been rested in the same way as the first pasture, but being a sown cereal and vetch hasn't got the density or the ground cover that the first pasture has. And so we see a different level of dry matter production there. If we now move on, and I think this is an important slide to consider and look at in regard to early season dry matter production and how well we are set up for winter. And there's often a height, pasture height versus density illusion, and that we can get trapped into with sown feeds. So when we have sown feeds on, say, 7.5 inch row spacings, we have a lot of bare earth there, and so if we had a common pasture height in these two pastures, if we had 10 centimetres of pasture height in both of these, the sown cereal and vetch perhaps, and a permanent pasture with excellent density and excellent level of ground cover, in the sown pasture for 10 centimetres of pasture height, we'd have around 650 kilos of dry matter. And for the dense pasture at that height, we'd have 1,900 kilograms of dry matter. So certainly can get caught with a height versus density illusion, and permanent pastures and with strong density and strong pasture cover do allow us to get strong early season production, and so that can be useful in autumn and winter in terms of having more kilos of dry matter there per hectare to be able to allocate and graze stock with. And that's why, if we swing back to the previous slide there, why we see very different growth rate in dry matter per hectare per day between pasture 1 and pasture 3 there. In regard to how pasture grows, pasture goes through 3 phases. So at the break of the season, we see the first leaf start emerging and coming out, and in that's sort of in phase 1. And we see that same slow growth immediately post-grazing when the plant starts to regrow. And so in that phase 1, or the first leaf stage, we see slow growth, and the plant is essentially relying on stored energy reserves in the base of the plant to push out and emerge that first leaf. That first leaf then starts to capture and harvest some sunlight, and as the second and third leaves come out, we see far more rapid growth rates as adequate leaf area ensures optimal growth. And so phase 2 is the most productive growth stage. That's when we see pastures growing the fastest and the quickest. And then they can move, depending on the plants, at which leaf stage, move into phase 3, where actually pasture production slows due to shading or decaying of the first leaf. And so all grass species, all grass pastures follow this sigmoid curve of slow in early leaf stage, rapid in phase 2, and then decline in phase 3. And if we look at this in the local region from May 2018 and growth rates for May or since the opening break, this is the sort of pattern that we will have observed. That as the first leaf is emerging on each tiller, we might have seen over the last 6 weeks growth rates during that first leaf stage of around 20 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. And leaf emergence rate has been around 10 to 12 days since the opening break. And so if we look at a 30-day window during May, while a pasture was pushing its first leaf out, it might have been growing at 20 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day for 10 days. And so 200 kilos of dry matter was produced in the first 10 days. And then as the second leaf emerges, that leaf will be wider and longer than the first, and it will end up about 30% longer than the first leaf. And so the pasture will be growing more rapidly, and we could see the pasture growing at 40 kilos per hectare per day during second leaf stage. And then for a ryegrass plant, the most productive leaf stage is the third leaf stage, and that'll be again wider and longer than the second leaf. And so we could see 60 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day being produced as that third leaf emerges. And so the interesting thing here to note is that for the month of May, if that pasture was rested and allowed to get to that most productive 3-leaf stage, we would see 1,200 kilos of pasture production for the month of May, but 50% of that, 600 of those 1,200 kilos, were produced in the last third of the rotation. And so it's allowing the plant to get to optimal leaf stage, which is allowing dry matter production to be optimised. And if we swing back a couple of slides now to look at the difference between pasture 1 and pasture 2 there, the difference there in that daily growth rate, average daily growth rate, since the break of 42 kilos versus 20 kilos, that's based on that first pasture being allowed to get to optimal leaf stage. And so we see that average daily growth rate up over 40, whereas the next pasture's been trapped in a one leaf stage, and so we've seen a much lower growth rate. So it's important to acknowledge how leaf stage has an influence over dry matter production, and how each grass species has an optimal leaf stage. For grazing, ryegrass is a 3-leaf plant. Phalaris and cocksfoot are 4-leaf plants, and it's enabling those plants to get to their optimal leaf stage to optimise dry matter production. I'll just stop there and check if there's any questions from anyone.
Yep, we've got one, Simon, from Tanya. Tanya asks, you define the break as the 18th of April. What are the parameters to define this? Many people I speak to, we've experienced a break yet.
For sure. So I guess what I've called a break there was a rainfall event of greater than 13, I guess it was 13 to 20 millimetres, and I guess it was a germinating rain that enabled a robust germination to start.
Excellent, thank you. Were there any other questions? Just while there is one from Rob. What is tall fescue's leaf?
Fescue's a
5. Leaf stage.
Yeah, so fescue's a 5-leaf plant.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, just while we're stopped quickly, to give you an idea of everyone's production systems, we might just try and launch this second and third poll. So if everyone could just click on their predominant production system, please.
You've swung back to you as a presenter, have you, Tara?
No, Simon, it's still on your screen, but it's just showing a poll quickly. So we should be able to manage that easily enough, I hope. It's a little bit longer. Excellent. Thank you. So just to share with you, Simon, and everyone else, predominantly we have merino sheep at 30%, breeding cattle at 28%, maternal and composite sheep at 23%, trading cattle at 15%, and others for 5%. So just that third quickly, what is your predominant pasture system, please? If everyone could just click on that quickly. Super, thank you. So we have 40% perennial pastures or a mix of perennials and annuals, 14% annual pastures, 5% others, and 2% cropping and stubble. So hopefully that helps everybody to get a bit of an idea. And moving on, Simon, we're back to you. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks for that. Okay, we'll now look at the slide on leaf emergence rates by month. And so leaf emergence rate is the rate that it takes for each leaf to fully emerge. And when a grass tiller grows, the second leaf won't start emerging until the first leaf is fully grown, and the third leaf won't start to emerge until the second leaf's fully grown. And leaf emergence rate is most influenced by temperature and then available moisture. And so naturally, leaf emergence rate is going to be most rapid when we've got warm temperatures and good available soil moisture. And if we have got low temperatures, which we have in winter, but moisture available, the low temperature is going to extend leaf emergence rate and make leaf emergence rate much slower. So in most regions of southern Australia, we would anticipate to see leaf emergence rates follow a pattern similar to this, where they'll be low in early April if we've got moisture available. So this assumes that there is moisture available. We might see 8-day leaf emergence rates in April, extending to 10 days in May as we shorten up day length and soil temperature drops. And then we could see it rapidly extend during winter to 18 or 20 days, and then we'll see it as we turn into spring, we'll see it shorten up significantly, and we'll end up back to an 8-day leaf emergence rate in October. And so this is the battle and the challenge that we have with winter production, is we've got such slow leaf emergence rate, and that's what's reducing our ability to accumulate dry matter during the winter months. And if we look at the rest periods there on that slide, if we're looking at a ryegrass plant as the reference plant to get to 3-leaf stage, during winter months, we really need 60 days of rest to allow a plant to get to that stage. And so that has a number of challenges for us from a grazing management perspective to be able to create that rest. And yeah, each grass species has an ideal leaf stage for grazing, and so ryegrass is a 3-leaf plant. So grazing at between 2.5 and 3-leaf stage works well. Coxfoot is a 4-leaf, Phalaris is a 4-leaf, and fescue is a 5-leaf plant. So if we have a look at this tiller here, this is the tiller that's been grazed, because we see that we've got that remnant leaf at the base of the plant with a square edge. That short remnant leaf would have been the youngest leaf when the plant was last grazed. We then see leaf 1 on the left-hand side of the tiller, leaf 2 on the right-hand side, leaf 3 on the left-hand side, and then leaf 4 just starting to emerge. And so as the ryegrass tiller grows, it's the most productive at the 3-leaf stage, and as the 4th leaf starts to emerge, the first leaf starts to wither and die. And so that's why we see that 3-leaf as being the most optimal stage because it's where dry matter production is optimised, but then beyond 3-leaf stage, we get leakage from the system as that first leaf wilts and dies. And there's a picture now on the slide of a ryegrass plant, and there's a collection of 3 tillers in that ryegrass plant. Each tiller has its own root system and its own growth points for the leaves. And so on the far left, that tiller is getting close to 2-leaf stage. On the far right, that tiller is at about 2.5-leaf stage because we see that 3rd leaf that's coming, it's not yet longer than 30% longer than the 2nd leaf. So that tiller's only at about 2.5-leaf stage. And the oldest tiller in the middle of the plant, we see the 1st leaf on the right, 2nd one on the left, 3rd on the right, and we're seeing the 4th leaf start to emerge there. So that's just past 3-leaf stage. So that's how to, and then when we're grazing, we want to be selecting leaf stage based on the representative average tiller across the pasture and across each plant. And so in terms of accumulating dry matter in the autumn and through winter, there's no more powerful force that exists for growing grass than the rest period and setting rotation lengths accordingly to enable plants and grasses to get to their optimal leaf stage. The great thing about clover, or people might be wondering how clover fits into the system. Clover production is optimised at the same time as the grass, essentially, and so clover's like the cool person that fits in and does whatever the rest of the crew wants in terms of what the grasses prefer. So the optimal stage to graze a grass and clover pasture will be when the leaf stage is right for the grass. That'll also fit in and work really well for the clover. Is there any questions there?
Not at this stage, Simon, no. Did anyone want to raise their hand or type a question into the question box? I think you're right to keep going, Simon.
Very good. So on the slide there now, I've got all of the factors that influence pasture growth through autumn and winter and also influence our decision making. And so there's certainly a large number of influencing factors. We have rainfall and stocking rate and day length and soil fertility and nutrition and daytime temperatures and post-grazing residuals, frost, our grazing management approach, soil temperatures, rest periods, commodity pricing, summer and autumn ground cover, supplementary feeding. These are all things that we have to make choices and decisions on, and these are all things that influence the level of pasture we've got available to us at the moment and how we'll get through the next few months. But if we structure those into accept versus manage, you'll notice on the left-hand side of the table there are things that are beyond our control. And so things that are beyond our control, we really just have to accept. And they are the rainfall we receive, day lengths, daytime temperatures, frost, soil temperature and commodity pricing cycles at any given time, and the cost of fodder. So we can't really change those things too much, and so we need to accept them. But the great news is there's a whole number of things that are within our control that we can manage and that we can proactively manage, and these are stocking rate, soil fertility and nutrition, post-grazing residuals. It's a choice how hard we graze the pasture before we move stock on to the next paddock. So post-grazing residual is a choice. Our grazing management and our grazing management skill, how long we rest pastures for before regrazing, how much cover we have across the summer and autumn months, and supplementary feeding decisions. And so the key aspect with supplementary feeding is to be strategic, because when we're supplementary feeding, we're generally feeding a diet that's 25 cents to 30 cents per kilogram of dry matter, rather than feeding a fresh green pasture-based diet, which is closer to 8 to 10 cents per kilogram of dry matter. So supplementary feeding, it's a far more expensive form of dry matter, and so it's important that we are strategic with how we're using supplementation. and using it strategically at a time of the year when we'll get an optimum benefit, or a time of the reproduction cycle where the cost-benefit analysis is robust. And if we then move on to what are some strategies to increase winter pasture production, and I guess, yes, we've had a dry autumn in parts of South Australia as we identified. We still don't really know what we're up for in terms of winter. The winter could well be an average winter or an above average winter. We're only 4 or so days into winter, and so we don't know yet. There's no guarantees either way, but these are strategies that we can apply to increase pasture production, whatever we end up getting thrown this winter. And I think it's interesting in Southern Australia and South Australia in particular to reflect back on at the end of June last year. Everyone felt pretty concerned after we'd had 23 or so frosts in a row in parts of June, and it was incredibly dry, but then we had a very strong July and August, or quite a strong July and August. So there's no guarantee that we're locked in for a tough winter. I guess we'll know in 3 months' time, but these are strategies that can be used to assist winter dry matter production. The first is extending rotation length by increasing the rest period, as we've discussed, and we'll explore that further. The next is applying nitrogen and potentially also gibberellic acid. The next is around enhancing soil fertility and managing ground cover in autumn ahead of the opening rain. And we can't really change that one now for the winter that's coming, but we could certainly change how we position ourselves ahead of next winter and next summer and autumn. So with extending the rotation length by increasing the rest period, to achieve this we have to make one of the following choices. We've either got to have some paddocks where we eat harder into the post-grazing residuals and create rest in the paddocks in front of us, and we have to then deal with the consequences of eating harder into post-grazing residuals. And the consequences there will be lower animal performance and also lower pasture recovery from eating harder into post-grazing residuals and potentially compromising the energy reserves in the base of the plant. But it is a choice and compromise that sometimes we might need to make to some degree to allow paddocks in front of us in the rotation to get to optimal leaf stage. Another choice is to add supplementary feed in the paddock and have those paddocks that are going to be eating harder into the post-grazing residual. We might also choose to add supplementary feed there to allow those stock to be in those paddocks longer, to create rest ahead of us to reach peak dry matter production. And something about adding supplementary feed in autumn or winter, if we're doing it in a manner in which we then hit the most productive growth stage of the plant, the most productive leaf stage, and we get twice the level of 50% of dry matter produced in the last third of the rotation, and we get twice the growth rate that we would in earlier leaf stages. Essentially, by adding supplementary feed to extend the rotation in that scenario, we halve the cost of supplementary feed, because for every tonne of supplementary feed that we're feeding to extend the rotation, we're getting a 2-for-1 payoff by having the plant reach the optimal leaf stage. And so while if we're feeding a supplementary feed that costs $250 a tonne, essentially if we've followed a way in which we create rest ahead of us and let the plant get to the optimal leaf stage, it's really only $125 a tonne because we've produced additional dry matter down the track. Now, that's again for confinement feeding. We could confinement feed during late April and May to allow the pastures to get to optimal leaf stage and set them up to have a good level of dry matter available for winter, or we could create more kilograms of dry matter per hectare by enhanced nutrition, by having soil pH right, by a robust phosphorus replacement strategy, or by applying nitrogen during the autumn and winter months, which will allow us to have more kilos of dry matter in the system, and so more kilos to allocate. We can then have longer rest periods, and we'll explore that nutrition one a little further now. But the powerful force here is recognising that 50% of the feed can be produced in the last third of the rotation. In regard to applying nitrogen, in autumn and winter. So nitrogen, a good way to look at nitrogen is it's an alternative to supplementary feed, or it's an alternative supplementary feed. And in autumn and winter, we can get a 10-to-1 response from nitrogen. So if 55 kilograms of urea has got around 25 units of nitrogen in it, which can convert to a 10-to-1 response, would allow that application of nitrogen to produce 250 kilos of additional dry matter per hectare. But we need to keep in mind that that's provided that we let the grass get to its optimal leaf stage. And if we go in before its optimal leaf stage, we will reduce the 10-to-1 response. The response from nitrogen is strongest between 55 and 110 kilos of urea per hectare, or between 25 to 50 units of N. And with nitrogen, ideally we'll be applying immediately post-grazing. So once the paddock's been grazed and defoliated, and if there's a rainfall event coming, apply the nitrogen, and that's when we'll be able to then have that pasture rested until it reaches optimal leaf stage again, and that's where we'll see the strongest dry matter production. So immediately post-grazing, or soon after you have confidence in the break and ahead of a 5 to 10 millimetre rainfall event. When we then cost out that, the cost of applying the nitrogen and that 10-to-1 response rate, we often find we will often get to a cost of between 13 cents and 16 cents per kilogram of dry matter for applying nitrogen. And so I guess that's between $130 and $160 a tonne, which for a high quality diet that animals can graze in the paddock and find themselves is often quite a bit more cost effective than other forms of supplementation, which might be 25 to 30 cents per kilogram of dry matter, particularly when you've built in labour. In regard to the use of gibberellic acid, the Pasture Principles view, and others might have different views and experiences in regards to gibberellic acid. The Pasture Principles view is that it works well when applied together with nitrogen, and it can potentially turbocharge the nitrogen response to 12.5 to 1 rather than 10 to 1. But that it's not particularly effective when applied by itself. And from some discussions with some growers last week where there was some gibberellic acid trials by itself, that's what they found, that it didn't actually increase dry matter production much by itself. It made things look good, but they didn't actually result in more kilograms of dry matter. So potentially the best use of gibberellic acid is to apply it with nitrogen to turbocharge the nitrogen response. Any questions here at this point?
Simon, while questions are coming in. Sorry, Tara, can I ask a quick question?
Sorry, Georgie.
That's okay. When's the best timing to be putting gibberellic acid out?
Yeah, so it would be at the same time as nitrogen in terms of its autumn and winter months are the times when we like to use nitrogen or gibberellic acid to create more kilograms of dry matter, and so I guess in the spring months that's when we're going to have rapid leaf emergence rates, and often we're challenged to keep on top of pasture production. And so unless we're really confident that we're going to be able to utilise the additional dry matter, applying nitrogen in the spring months potentially might just grow more kilograms of compost. And so, nitrogen and gibberellic acid are best used in the autumn and winter, or nitrogen in the autumn and winter months, gibberellic acid in the winter months. But the Pasture Principles view on it is to be used in conjunction with nitrogen. There might be some different thoughts on applying it by itself, but that would be a bit outside of my experience.
Thanks.
Okay, Rob. Sorry, Georgie.
All good. You go ahead, Tara.
Thank you. Rob asks, how much nitrogen on a young ryegrass or cereal rye can be put on before it's dangerous to the first grazing? Is there a quick, affordable test that can be used, or management precautions that can be done? There are no runoff from paddocks this time around for most graziers.
For sure. It's a really good question around safety from nitrogen applications in terms of nitrate poisoning and being safe for the stock, and particularly not creating a subclinical effect such as a reduced reproduction rate. So the rules of thumb around safety are to wait 1 day per kilogram of nitrogen applied. So if we apply 25 kilograms of nitrogen, to wait 25 days from an animal safety perspective. Or another way to look at it is 2 full leaves have emerged since the nitrogen was applied. So 2 full leaves since the nitrogen's been applied, or 1 day per kilogram of N, is the way to look at when it's ready from a grazing safety perspective. But keep in mind that to optimise dry matter production and get our 10-to-1 response, we really want to wait until 3 full leaves have emerged post-application, assuming that it is applied immediately post the grazing or defoliation.
So just to follow on from that, David asks what grazing withhold period is acceptable for 55 kilos per hectare or 110 kilos per hectare of urea broadcast?
Yeah, so using those principles, that would be 25 days for 55 kilos of urea, or 50 days for 100 kilos of urea.
Excellent. Thank you.
Or until. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions there, Tara?
Yeah. So a question from Jody is, how do you apply gibberellic acid, and can you comment on the cost, please?
Sure. So yeah, gibberellic acid it's a low cost product, and so it's the application cost that is the real thing. So it's and so it can be easily added to a boom spray mix if someone's putting out a liquid form of nitrogen such as UAN, and so it's a very low cost, and it's more that application cost. So if you're applying UAN to pastures, you can add gibberellic acid at the same time for a very extremely low cost, and you're already doing that pass. I guess the challenge is with using UAN versus using urea is that we're often 25% or 30% more expensive per unit of nitrogen to use UAN. So if we're using the most cost-effective form of urea, of nitrogen, is probably granular urea. And so I guess that's another limitation with gibberellic acid is there a way that it can be applied with something else that's going on, because it's really the application cost of $12 a hectare or so that's the true cost.
And is gibberellic acid best applied to permanent pastures? From Graham.
That's right, and I think and I'm not a gibberellic acid expert, so my responses here mightn't be perfect, but it is to permanent pastures, and it's more effective on cocksfoot and phalaris than it is on ryegrass-based pastures. So, but yeah, I guess overall, to get value from gibberellic acid, I like to be using it in conjunction with nitrogen, where we are turbocharging that response and know that we're getting a response from it.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other questions at this point for Simon?
Very good.
You're right to keep rolling, Simon.
Okay, so the next strategy to enhance winter dry matter production is around enhancing soil fertility, and so the first step there is to have a really robust replacement phosphorus strategy. So 1 DSE per hectare removes approximately 1 unit of phosphorus per annum. So if we've got a 10 DSE per hectare stocking rate, we need to be applying 10 units of phosphorus per annum to have a robust replacement strategy around phosphorus. And if we don't have a robust replacement strategy around phosphorus, we can see dry matter production slowly deteriorate over time, and then it's a long journey to build back up. So big advocate of a replacement phosphorus strategy. If we're moving from a 10 DSE to a 12 DSE stocking rate, one of the most important things we do is increase from applying 10 units of phosphorus to applying 12 units of phosphorus per annum to match that stocking rate. So if we increase stocking rate, we need to increase replacement phosphorus accordingly as a foundation stone for dry matter production. And soil pH is also a foundation stone to dry matter production, and so if we've got acidic soils, then it's worthwhile to explore liming those soils to set them up to then optimise dry matter production. And another way to enhance soil fertility is to optimise pasture harvest and shedded root mass. So we see there root mass at different leaf stages on a grass, so you'll see the amount of root growth there from at 1 leaf stage, 2 leaf stage, and 3 leaf stage, and so we'll see there that root growth is you've got the most significant root growth at 3 leaf stage, and then when the plant is grazed and defoliated through grazing, the plant will shed most of its root mass. So every time we harvest a tonne of dry matter above the ground, we'll be shedding a tonne of root mass underneath the ground, and so that will assist with then enhancing long-term soil fertility. Just noting here, there's a couple of gibberellic acid comments coming through from the audience. For gibberellic acid, you need a minimum of 1,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare. 1,100 to 1,200 kilograms is better, and gibberellic acids works on any pasture or forage over 8 weeks old. So, yeah, thanks for that additional info from the audience there. So soil fertility is certainly going to influence our dry matter production over winter. This is a slide there now that shows soil pH and nutrient availability at different levels of soil pH, and we'll see that below pH 5.5 and certainly below 5, we have very limited availability of a number of the core nutrients that pasture needs to grow and flourish, and so optimising soil pH is a foundation stone. Managing ground cover in autumn. So if we've got greater ground cover in autumn, and driving around in autumn, you'll see very different levels of ground cover on different farms and different properties. And if we're below 1,000 kilos of dry matter, then and significantly below that, then we're going to be at risk of missing out on water harvest and missing out on preserving what rainfall we do get through the autumn months. And so having a stronger level of ground cover in autumn improves water harvest and retention, preserves rainfall received and stored soil moisture for longer. It'll also reduce the evaporation rate at the surface and will allow for stronger pasture growth rates in May and June. So every year, our decisions in autumn around how much ground cover we get to or get down to will influence our autumn and winter growth. Any further questions on there?
Any questions for Simon? I haven't got any at this stage, Simon.
Okay, thank you. In regard to measuring and predicting pasture growth, so the key here with measurement is that frequency trumps accuracy. So yes, accuracy is important, and we need to have something that's simple and easy to use and relatively consistent. But the key thing is that when we're measuring and predicting pasture growth is to be frequently monitoring, and I like to be monitoring average pasture cover across the farm on a monthly basis, and also measuring pasture growth rates more accurately, more often than that. And so yeah, frequency trumps accuracy is a principle. And so what we'd like is something that's easy to use, and consistency is the key. My personal preference is to use a rising plate meter. I like plate meters because they're simple, they're fast, they're consistent between different users once the use of them has been explored in terms of the style it takes when using a plate meter to measure pasture accurately, and they provide good accuracy across all weather conditions. So yeah, there's a rising plate meter there in the centre of the photo, and a very simple device where the plate meter rises up to the pasture height. The pin drops down in the middle to give us a pasture height at any stage during the growing season, and then there's a series of formulas in there to convert that to dry matter production or kilos of dry matter available or food. and I take pasture cuts to calibrate the plate meter, and that's how I've set the regression equations according to be calibrated in that manner. Very easy to use, very simple to use, and as you see by this photo, you can almost train your cows to use them. Further on measuring pasture, regularly monitoring and measuring pasture allows reference points for pasture growth rates and feed budgeting. It gives us early indicators to increase or decrease stocking rates depending on how a season is tracking. It gives us greater insight into pasture allocations, and availability drives intake, and intake drives animal performance. It gives us a great opportunity to assess leaf stage and leaf emergence rate, and that's what I like about a plate meter, is it's got you physically out there walking across a paddock, so you can quickly kneel down, have a look at the tiller stage and see what leaf stage is at and what leaf emergence rate is doing. And the other great thing about measuring pasture quickly and easily and regularly with a plate meter is that it will build your own evidence of the growth rates at different leaf stages, and you really have to measure that yourself to fully appreciate how growth rates change at different leaf stages. So yeah, calculating pasture growth rates is relatively easy. On rested pastures, it's simply if we measured the pasture today, or if we measured it on the 31st of May and there was 1,900 kilos there, and we measured it previously on the 15th of May and there was 16 days that had transpired there, then growth rate will be current pasture cover less previous pasture cover divided by the days in between. So therefore, that example there, it was 1,900 kilos on the 31st of May, it was 1,100 kilos on the 15th. We see a pasture growth rate there of 50 kilos of dry matter per day, which is that 800 kilos of pasture growth divided by 16 days. And of course, if we're measuring growth rates on paddocks that are stocked, then we need to adjust for what animal intake has been and for how many days those animals have been on the pasture. And so if we've got ewes in late pregnancy or lactation at the moment, they'll be eating and requiring around 2.5 kilos of pasture a day, and so we would adjust the growth rate according to that pasture harvest by the animals. Any questions there?
Any questions for Simon? No, Simon, I think you're right to keep rolling just for the moment.
Very good. I'll just have a discussion now, a short discussion in regard to pasture allocation. So there's a number of rules of thumb that we introduce and work through in the pasture principles package in regard to animal requirements at different points in the reproduction cycle. And a quick example there is for finishing 40 kilo lambs. So the maintenance intake for the number of kilos of pasture production that that lamb requires on a daily basis is live weight times 2 divided by 100, which is another way of saying 2%. And so for a 40 kilo lamb, they require 0.8 kilograms of fresh green vegetative pasture, assuming around 10 megajoules of energy per kilo of dry matter. For growth rate, they require a multiplier of 4 in addition to maintenance intake. So if we want a lamb growing at 250 grams a day, 250 grams times 4 is 1 kilo of dry matter intake over and above their maintenance requirements. So to finish that 40 kilo lamb, at 250 grams a day, they would need 1.8 kilos of fresh green pasture, or around 18 megajoules of energy. If we look at then, it can enable an interesting discussion on the efficiency of faster growing lambs rather than slower growing lambs. And here, if we've got a growth rate of 100 grams through to 300 grams, that maintenance intake for a 40 kilo lamb will always be the same, but they'll need a different level of intake for growth. And lambs that are growing at 100 grams a day, you'll see their total intake there will be 1.2 kilos a day, or around 12 megajoules of energy, through to a lamb growing at 300 grams a day will need 2 kilos of pasture per day, or 20 megajoules of energy. But what's interesting there is to look at the percentage of the diet that's going towards production, and you'll see with slow growing lambs, we've only got 33% of the diet going towards production, and 67% of the diet's being burnt by daily maintenance. So much more efficient from a pasture allocation perspective to have faster growing lambs, and that'll be through a combination of pasture availability, pasture quality, animal health, genetics, and pasture allocation, and temperature and environmental influences. So if we have a look at a summary of the key messages, leaf stage is the best barometer for when pasture is ready to graze. All pastures follow that sigmoid growth curve. The rotation length or rest period is a powerful tool to grow more kilos of dry matter. Winter is always going to be a challenging period for us due to slow leaf emergence rates. Nitrogen can be a cost-effective mechanism to increase dry matter production in winter. If we get that 10-to-1 response, it can be 13 cents per kilo. Soil fertility and ground cover going into late autumn and winter will also make a difference. Regular pasture measurement helps inform decision making and know your animal intake requirements at different points in the reproduction cycle, and that's a real strength of the Pasture Principles package. Just a quick slide there on those Pasture Principles workshops that are coming up, one in Clare and Millicent in late June, and they involve a 2-day workshop followed by the coaching sessions. And they involve a producer investment of $1,850 plus GST per business for up to 3 people, but it's a package that allows a lot of grazing management to be explored in depth, and it's really strong on the pasture animal interface and the different nutritional requirements for different classes of stock for beef and for sheep at different points in the reproduction cycle. There's my contact details up there on the screen if anyone would like to discuss any of these aspects further, and with that I'll hand back to Tara.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon. Did anyone have any last questions for Simon?
Tara, it's Georgie here. While there's questions potentially coming in, I've got a sheepy question for you, Simon.
Sure.
In terms of, you're saying we need to try and rest our pastures, but we're also being told by, sheep people that we should be having smaller lambing mobs. What do we take away from that? At the moment we've got our ewes out in small lambing mobs because we think we're doing the right thing for our lamb survival, but what's it doing to our pastures and how do we rectify that?
For sure, and it's a really good point, Georgie, and something that we have to balance up, and it's one of the compromises that we have to make in the grazing management system. So I guess every day and every week in grazing management, we're having to balance up a compromise of some sort, and so definitely agree with the message around small mob size for lambing and the ability of that to increase lamb survival in twin-bearing ewes. And so I guess it just, it becomes part of the year where we're just going to have to recognise that we'll need to be set stocked and that we'll need to be having, no animal movement for that 5 or 6 week lambing period. And so I guess it's then around setting us, recognising that that's the time in the year when we have to set stock, and we have to set stock at certain densities and have small mob size, but then as quickly as possible, and so hopefully at marking, getting ewes back together in larger mob sizes and creating a rotation with some rest in it. And so, it's just one of those things that we have to balance up. And I guess the key thing is that we've got our paddocks well set up for lambing, and that picture that I showed earlier there with 2,600 kilos of dry matter on the 31st of May, essentially that was a paddock that was set up to have twin-bearing ewes put in it, 6 ewes per hectare for the next 5 weeks. But they'd used rest ahead of the lambing period in that context to enable small mob size at lambing.
Great, thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Georgie. No questions have come through for the moment. So, Simon, did you have any concluding comments that you wanted to make?
I think that's got it covered off. Thanks. And sorry my slides weren't showing right at the start there.
That's all right. It was a very thorough presentation. Thank you. Georgie, did you have anything else that you'd like to add?
I just had one more question. If we've got a mixed pasture of phalaris and ryegrass, what leaf stage do we graze to?
That's another really good question there, Georgie. And so if we come back to the pasture principles, pasture principles ideally would prefer less grass species in a pasture mix rather than more. And then when you've got a dominant pasture grass type such as ryegrass or phalaris or cocksfoot in the one paddock, then you can just graze it according to optimal leaf stage. Now, naturally, I recognise there's a lot of pastures out there that involve both, perennial ryegrass and phalaris or perennial ryegrass and cocksfoot. And so essentially it's a decision as your choice as the grazing manager, and I guess you'd either set it according to either the most dominant grass in the pasture, and that way you're getting it right for the most dominant species, or set it according to the species that you would like to persist and be the most dominant in that pasture sward, and then that way you are setting leaf stage by the plant that you want to persist the most, and that's the outcome that you'll get. Interesting, last week when we were in the Southern Grampians and we were looking at a ryegrass and phalaris pasture, the phalaris was actually at 4-leaf stage and the ryegrass was at 3-leaf stage, and so it wasn't actually too much of a compromise. That pasture was ready to be grazed at the optimal leaf stage for both in that scenario where they were cohabitating. So sometimes the compromise isn't as big as you think because of different leaf emergence rates between the two species.
Yep, brilliant. Thanks for clarifying that one, Simon. Any more questions there, Tara?
No, that's everything tonight. Thanks, Georgie. So thank you, Simon, and thank you, Georgie. Thanks very much.